Hello everyone, welcome back to Rewired with your host Khadija Farrosh. For those of you just joining us, this podcast is all about differentiating between fact and fiction through exploring our teenage minds and psychology. Now I don't want to spoil the rest of the episode, so I want you all to sit back, relax, and enjoy. Have you ever met someone and immediately thought they were extremely intelligent just because they spoke confidently? Or maybe you assumed that someone was trustworthy just because they had a nice smile. On the flip side, have you ever judged someone negatively because of one minor detail, like the way they dressed or how awkward they may have seemed at first? Well, if you have, you've experienced the halo effect, or its opposite, the horn effect. The halo effect is this almost automatic bias that shapes our first impressions, often without us realizing it. We take a noticeable trait like someone's appearance, someone's voice, or even job title, status, things like that, and use them to form an overall judgment about their personality, intelligence, or abilities before even getting to know them. While it might feel like we're just being intuitive or we're making accurate assumptions, in reality our brains are taking a shortcut which is not always accurate. In today's episode, I'm going to break down why our brains do this, how it impacts our daily lives, and most importantly, how to stop falling for it. So what exactly is the halo effect? The halo effect occurs when our overall positive impression of a person or product is based on a single characteristic that we first viewed. So if our first impression is positive, then the subsequent judgments that we make will be influenced by this first impression. It's essentially a cognitive bias, which is a psychological term, that was studied by a psychologist named Edward Thorndike in the 1920s, which is when it was officially recognized as a bias, or psychological concept. He noticed something interesting while studying military officers when he asked their superiors to rate soldiers on one trait, like their leadership, physical appearance, intelligence, loyalty, things like that. Thorndike's goal was to determine how ratings of one quality influenced assessments of other qualities. He found that high ratings of a particular trait correlated to high ratings of other traits, and vice versa. So negative traits, which were rated low, also led to lower ratings of other characteristics. He cited that the correlations were too high and too even. So, for example, the average correlation for physique and intelligence was 0.31, physique and leadership was 0.39, and physique and character was 0.28. If I were to explain this outside of scientific terms, then that would mean, for example, if someone was rated high in conventional attractiveness, then this would be correlated with intelligence and, say, leadership, for example. There is also the reverse halo effect, also known as the horn effect. As the name implies, this occurs when a person judges another person negatively based on their first impression, which happened to be negative, after only witnessing one characteristic. This single characteristic influences all of the other ones, like the halo effect. For example, a person might assume that somebody they view as unattractive, in their own opinion, is also unkind, before getting to know the other person. This happens everywhere. This can be seen in all places. The halo effect is why, say for example, attractive people or conventionally attractive people are often assumed to be more competent, why celebrities get away with more problematic behavior because of their high status, and why some people may be taken more seriously just because they dress a certain way. In science, it particularly touches on attractiveness and, physical characteristics because they're what's first viewed, and because a lot of the studies that have been conducted regarding the halo effect only have looked on physical appearance and its influence on first impressions. Let's talk about how this plays out in real life. I wanted to discuss a few examples that you may have encountered, whether personally or you may have seen through TV, film, media, etc. So I wanted to touch on the most relevant to us, which is school. Have you guys ever noticed how some teachers may treat well-behaved, quote-unquote, students as if they're automatically smarter? A 1973 study found that more conventionally attractive or well-dressed students are perceived by teachers to be more self-confident or to have better leadership traits. That is put in comparison with quote-unquote unattractive students, even if there is no actual difference in their intelligence and actual capabilities. This can lead to a lot of ethical dilemmas. For example, students might be getting better grades not because they're smarter, but because they fit a certain image. They might be receiving better treatment from teachers or even other students because of their attractiveness or physical characteristics. On the other hand, another study found that when teachers are more conventionally attractive in the eyes of students, these students achieve higher academic performance because they're more motivated, for example, to work. And that teachers' attire influences children's psychology through their learning ability, motivation, discipline, working style, and attitude. And I wanted to give just a quick disclaimer. In order to keep content digestible and clear, I make data and research results a little more condensed and diluted. So I do recommend that you check out the paper that I linked below, which talks more about this study in more detail. So the next example that I wanted to discuss was social media. This one is definitely more prevalent in today's age, in the direction that we're headed in terms of the rise of social media and technology. So studies have shown that influencers perceived as physically attractive are often deemed more credible and trustworthy when they're discussing something, regardless of their actual expertise or knowledge in the field. So this perception significantly boosts their, let's say, persuasive power, because it leads to followers to be more inclined to trust their recommendations and make purchases and buy things based on their endorsements and their advertisements. This concept describes how an individual's physical appearance can create this halo that positively influences perceptions of their other qualities, such as expertise and reliability in a certain field, which does have real-life impacts like affecting consumer decisions and social media marketing. This is less relevant to our generation. However, there have been a lot of encounters in work settings where the halo effect has created some dilemmas. People that are perceived as physically attractive by employers may be more likely to be hired than those perceived as less attractive than the employers, which is extremely unethical, and I have linked a paper below which discusses studies that have been conducted regarding this in more detail. Now, I know what you're thinking. After the examples and definitions I just gave, you still don't know why this actually happens, and why our brains do this. Well, it all comes down to cognitive shortcuts. Our brains are psychologically wired to make quick judgments to save energy and save time. So instead of processing every single, minor detail about a person, we take mental shortcuts, which are called heuristics in psychology, so HEURISTIC, which is essentially assuming that if one trait is good, everything else about them must be good too, or everything else about a person must be good too. It's efficient and it's quick, but it is flawed as well. There's also an evolutionary angle that some scientists and psychologists have taken or looked at. Some psychologists believe that this bias helped early humans make quick survival decisions. So if someone looked strong and confident, they were probably a good leader, for example. But if someone looked sick or weak, they might be a danger to the group. The problem about this is that we're no longer living in small tribes, so it's slightly worrying that our brains still rely on these judgment patterns to this day. And then there's social conditioning and reinforcement, which I think is extremely important to discuss. From an early age, we're taught to associate attractiveness, confidence, and certain clothing styles even with success. And if you really think about it, it's reinforced in movies, advertisements, books, any form of media now. This idea is boosted. And a lot of this is shaped on societal stereotypes, and it's rooted in historical influences. So race, skin color, gender, physical characteristics like height, physique, hair, clothing style, etc. They each have their own stereotypical meaning, which have been wired into our minds, but in reality they mean nothing. And this introduces the next part pretty well. With this, I wanted to break down ways we can stop falling for the bias, the halo effect. I broke it down into 4 simple steps, which I think are important to be heard. So the first one is I recommend that everybody pauses and questions their first impressions. Everyone needs to slow down. If you find yourself assuming that someone is smart or kind or capable right away, just ask yourself, am I basing this off of physical evidence or evidence I've seen, or just one trait or one encounter that I had with this person? The second is looking beyond appearance. So I recommend that you try to get to know people for who they actually are, rather than relying on surface level judgments to make final conclusions on what a person is like. Understanding a person takes time, and basing it off of a physical characteristic or one conversation that you may have had with them is not a very successful and accurate technique. My third one is being mindful of social media. So just because somebody looks like an expert doesn't actually mean that they are. Be sure to check credentials and reliability of a source or an influencer before taking advice from them. Finally, give people second chances. The first impression isn't always accurate, and sometimes the most interesting people aren't the ones who stand out immediately, or aren't the ones you may anticipate them to be based on, a look around in a room, or a quick introduction or conversation. Alright, so today we talked about the halo effect and how it's one of those biases that influences us way more than we actually think. But I do know that once we're more aware of it, we can start making better and more fair judgments about the people around us. Make sure to check the papers and studies that I've linked below if you want to read more about the studies that I discussed in the previous sections. Alright, that's a wrap for today's episode. If you want to keep the conversation going, you can find me on Instagram and YouTube at OfficialRewired. My email is khadija.farrash@gmail.com if you'd like to contact me there. That's khadija.farrash@gmail.com. Or if you're feeling extra chatty, join our community Discord where you can hang out and discuss this and upcoming episodes, have access to early snippets and announcements, and a couple more special perks. You can find all the links to my socials in the show notes below and in the Linktree in my description. Don't forget to drop a comment, question, feedback, or anything you'd like to let me know of down below if you're feeling extra generous. And if you really enjoyed, a 5-star rating on Spotify or a like and subscribe on YouTube would mean the world. I can't wait to chat with you again soon, and see you in the next episode.